everyone. Welcome to George Mason University's Creative Writing Department's ongoing series of creative writers and visiting writers. My name is Greg Wilhelm. I am the director of Mason Creative Writing, and welcome to tonight's very special first event in our ongoing series of visiting writers. Every semester or every year, we bring up to 12 visiting writers to campus where they engage our students, um, talk to them about craft, and then they had these public events which are very special to us. And we're doing it online this year. It's a little bit different, but it's very exciting too. So I want to thank Fall for the Book. They're part of producing this event tonight, and Mason Creative Writing, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary. I want to thank Jen Stevens and the Fenwick Library, who is also partners for the Visiting Writers Series. Jen Stevens is the team leader for Arts and Humanities at the library, and we really appreciate them being an ongoing partner as we go online for this series. So it's a very special evening this evening. We're going to welcome Robin Hemley, and without any further ado, let me kick it over to MFA faculty member Tim DeNevy, who will introduce our very special reader and guest for this evening.
Thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you today. My name is Tim DeNevy, and welcome to Fall for the Book 2020. These events will be going from September through November. You can find the full schedule at fallforthebook.org. Everybody's doing a wonderful job pulling this together in our virtual space during this very specific and bewildering fall that we're all making our way through. You can follow Fall for the Book on Crowdcast, and thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure to introduce Robin Hemley today. I get a bit of background. Robin is the author of 12 books of fiction and nonfiction, and is the founder of NonfictioNOW, the world's leading international conference in nonfiction. He graduated from the Writers Workshop, and he returned to Iowa for 9 years, where he directed the nonfiction writing program. Contributing editor to the Iowa Review and Advisory Board of Fourth Genre. He has many years of publishing experience, including 5 years as the editor of the Bellingham Review, where he founded the Annie Dillard in nonfiction and Tobias Wolff Award in fiction. His most recent book is Borderline Citizen: Dispatches from the Outskirts of Nationhood. I've been lucky enough to know Robin for over a decade now, and as an MFA student in Iowa, he was my thesis advisor, and I was able to work closely on both my own writing and on other projects with him. And we'll get to the reading right now, but I'd just like to say that we come across a lot of people in the world of writing, in the world of literature, and the world of the arts. But for me, Robin has always been one of those rare combinations of an outstanding writer, an outstanding teacher, and an outstanding person. And I'm so happy that we can have him here today at George Mason. Robin, it's good to see you.
Great seeing you, Tim. Thank you so much. That's such a lovely introduction. I'm glad it's recorded, so I can play it over and over. Tim's a wonderful writer, so it was easy I didn't teach him. He just wrote under in my program. So anyway, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm going to be reading from my new book, Borderline Citizen: Dispatches from the Outskirts of Nationhood, which I like to describe as a hybrid of travelogue, memoir, and reportage. It's a book that deals with nationalism, patriotism, and belonging by looking at the borders that divide and sometimes unite us. Exiles, refugees, and the odd international pockets of territory known as exclaves and enclaves are my central interests in the book of linked essays. So I'm going to read a very condensed version for time's sake of my chapter on perhaps the most unusual pair of border towns in the world, Barley-Nassau and Barley-Hertog. But before I begin, I'll just mention that one of the things that I did with the book was to go to these little pockets of national territory, like these enclaves on the border of Belgium and the Netherlands, all over the world, there are all these places. Like there's one dangling off a peninsula of Canada that it goes right below the 49th parallel, and because of that, it's a part of the U.S., but it's inaccessible by roads from one U.S. place to another because it's cut off. So you have to kind of go around into Canada to get to it. And there are places like this all over the world. So I tended to go to them around their national holidays because I've always been interested in notions of patriotism and belonging and nationalism. I really started the book about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, before, I mean, nationalism was definitely on the rise, but it wasn't what it is now. And so, anyway, I'm going to read this condensed version of my chapter called Don't Be Too Difficult. A simple walk through the twin towns of Barley-Nassau and Barley-Hertog on the Dutch-Belgian border has one crossing the international border multiple times, often marked on the sidewalks by X's, the flags flying from various buildings, and the address plates on the doors depicting either Belgian or Dutch flags. The international border runs through the front door of one home, which consequently has two address plates and two doorbells as well. There are two of everything here: two mayors, two police chiefs, two fire stations, two post offices, two hospitals, two city councils, two schools. But there's one celebration today. Since my arrival, the town has filled up with hundreds, if not thousands, of people in attendance. The enclaves of the Barleys have brought prosperity to the towns, first through smuggling and later through tourism. For that reason, in large part, a number of the attempts to swap territories at an international level were heartily resisted by the citizens of the town. To get rid of the borders here would be to solve a problem that doesn't need solving and transform the town into just another ordinary village near a border. It's after 11, but the square in front of my hotel is still packed with several hundred revelers. It's going to be a while before I get to sleep tonight, so I check the news on my phone from back home, which welcomes me back to the Netherlands, when I'm safely tucked into my bed. But perhaps safely is the wrong word. I read of Mia Irizarry, who, wearing a t-shirt with the Puerto Rican flag on it, was preparing a space in a Chicago park she had rented for her 24th birthday when 62-year-old Timothy Tribus happened by. If you're an American citizen, he told her, you should not be wearing that t-shirt in America. She tried to explain to the man that Puerto Rico is part of America, but he continued to harangue her. You are not going to change us, he told her. You know that. The world is not going to change the United States of America, period. There it is, the cri de coeur of all nationalists, the idea that nothing should ever change, that change equals corruption, that purity exists and should be preserved. At the tourist office, I'm met by 66-year-old William Van Gool the next day, a trim, compact man with white hair and an easy smile, who brings me to a room with a map spread on the table of all the enclaves of Barley-Nassau and Barley-Hertog. The map shows 22 pieces of Belgium situated in the Netherlands and 7 pieces of the Netherlands lying within Belgian enclaves, making them counter-enclaves. A solitary Dutch enclave lies across the greater Belgium border several kilometers away from where I sit. There are, of course, problems created by the very nature of two towns in two different countries intersecting one another so intricately. Gray areas in the law sometimes require looking the other way. In the Netherlands, you have to be 18 to drink, but in Belgium, it's 16. So a lot of Dutch youngsters step into one of the bars in Barley-Hertog to drink. This practice and some others are greeted with a laissez-faire attitude, the dictum being, Willem tells me, don't be too difficult. When I first started looking into the Barleys, I had read somewhere of an incident in the 1960s in which a motorcyclist had been thrown from his cycle into a Belgian enclave. The first EMT crew on the scene was Dutch, but they were forbidden from crossing the boundary into Belgium to treat the man. As a consequence, the man had died. Before traveling to Barley, I had looked everywhere for the source of the story, but I couldn't find it. So I decided to ask Willem if there's any truth to the tale. As soon as the words motorcycle accident leave my lips, Willem cuts me off. You heard that, he says, putting down his cup. I don't understand why the question would be so shocking, but I know I've said something wrong. It gives me a sad feeling, he says softly. That was my brother. What? Oh, I'm so sorry. I never would have brought it up so blithely or brought it up at all if I had known that the motorcyclist was Willem's brother. But that kind of coincidence can't be anticipated. I apologize again. No, I can live with that, he says. No problem. It's remarkable that you've heard that, but it's correct. It was one of the instigations to make our cooperation better. His brother and brother's girlfriend had been traveling to a local pub. The owner of the pub was in the car in front, and Willem imagines, though he can't say for certain, that perhaps the two vehicles were playing games. Whatever the case, the motorcycle hit the car, and both Willem's brother and the girlfriend were ejected. When a Dutch ambulance crew arrived, they started working with the victims, getting ready to transport them. Everyone knew where the enclaves were, but they didn't say anything. But one guy, perhaps not so clever, Willem says, suddenly announced, "Hey guys, I think this is Belgium." And that was it. Because this guy had voiced the obvious but unspoken, they couldn't proceed, and it took the whole day for a Belgian ambulance crew to arrive. Who knows if she would have survived if she had been, Willem's brother had died instantly when he hit a tree, but the girlfriend was alive when the crew arrived. Who knows if she would have survived if she had been treated right away. As it was, she lasted only another day. There were other problems that were not so much the result of the border, but as a consequence of the almost inevitable tension of two different groups living side by side. Packs of school children would cause trouble on their way to school and on their way home, sometimes getting into fights and often trading insults. The Belgian mayor, Alphonse Fons Cornelissen, hit on the idea of beginning and then ending the school days half an hour apart so that the groups would be less likely to encounter one another in their little packs. The second step in his plan was to initiate a youth camp for the Belgian and Dutch children. The idea being that in bringing the children together, you would also bring the parents along. I just happened to arrive in Barley, Nassau, and Hertog during the week of this annual youth competition, 6 days of cycling around the countryside, competing in games and winning trophies, featuring 700 children of mixed Belgian and Dutch teams and guided by 180 adults, also mixed. Fons Cornelissen inherited his good sense and creative community spirit from his mother, perhaps inherited his good sense and creative community spirit from his mother, perhaps a hero of both world wars, Maria Verhoeven. To show me her contributions, Willem drives me several kilometers to the main Belgian-Dutch border near the village of Zonderregen, distinguished by a towering church spire and surrounded by farm fields. Here in 1915, the Germans constructed a section of electrified border fence in the matter of a day. The death wire, as it came to be known, killed thousands. This was at a time when virtually no one in the area had electricity and people barely knew what electricity was. At a replicated stretch of the electric fence, photos and text explain some of these casualties, including the gruesome photo of a farmer who had grabbed the fence, obviously thinking it harmless. Another plaque told the story of Louis van den Heuvel, who on December 19, 1915, went to the border to deliver a bucket of food to his 15-year-old daughter who worked as a maid on the Dutch side. As he tried to deliver the food, a Dutch border guard shot and killed him. Willem, standing next to this now innocuous fence, muses on how people are still being smuggled over borders in the world today. but by different sorts of people and not necessarily for altruistic reasons. I consider how ineffective yet cruel walls invariably are. Maria Verhoeven, known locally as Miet Pauw, only a teenager when hostilities began, spent much of the war smuggling people from occupied Belgium to the neutral Netherlands. The replica fence, replete with white porcelain pin insulators spaced regularly like ornaments, has a section that illustrates how people like Verhoeven solved the electric problem. Wearing insulated rubber gloves, they constructed wooden spacers or tunnels, even barrels for people to crawl through. Searching her house, police found the incriminating gloves and arrested her as a suspected smuggler. But she was released when the war ended not long after. The hated fence was demolished the moment it lost its power. The white porcelain insulators left by the thousands in the fields. On our way back to Barley, we passed many groups of children on their bikes competing in this year's sports week, now in its 51st year. We stopped briefly at the cultural center situated in an old convent for now, though there are plans to construct a new center with the border running through it. During World War II, Maria Verhoeven once again pitched in, this time helping downed Allied pilots and escaped prisoners find their way to safety. As the 1st Polish Armored Division was advancing on German lines in 1944, she and 2 other compatriots were arrested. This time she was not so fortunate. Less than a month before the Poles liberated the town, she and her fellow resistors were taken away and shot. Today, she's widely remembered and honored by a monument, a street named after her, photos of her on plaques. I've never found such self-sacrifice meaningless. On the contrary, the stories of people such as Maria Verhoeven, who sacrificed themselves for strangers, have always moved me tremendously. Like the Polish priest Maximilian Kolbe, who took the place of a stranger at Auschwitz, condemned to death along with 9 others for the escape of another man from the death camp. I once met a Polish artist in Krakow who chronicles in his photography the repurposing of desecrated Jewish tombstones. He showed me walls that had used tombstones, garden paths, even an entire house made of tombstones. Afterwards, we sat drinking coffee, and he mused aloud, I asked myself, if I lived during the Second World War, what would I have done? And I don't know. It's an open question. I hope that I would be helping other people, but I'm not sure of that. I'd like to be sure of that. In the Barleys, at least, the time is long gone when people died crossing the border to help a loved one, or died defying the border to help a stranger, or died because of absurd technicalities that prevented them from being treated for their injuries. Over the years, the border has evolved into a geographical curiosity, where the typical tourist picture has you posing with one leg in Belgium and one in the Netherlands. That evening, I make the mistake once more of reading the news back home, and I learn of a 92-year-old man from Mexico walking in his son's neighborhood in Los Angeles, who was assaulted on July 4th by 30-year-old Lakeisha Jones, yelling, go back, go back. She beat him bloody with a brick, enlisting a group of men passing by, telling them falsely he had tried to kidnap her daughter, after which they enthusiastically joined in kicking him while he lay on the ground. I should probably stop reading the news, but that won't stop these things from happening. Instead, I whistle a little bit of America from West Side Story and turn out the lights by my bed. Okay, thanks.
That's fantastic, Robin. Thank you for reading that. If for those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please go ahead and post them, and we can ask them through the crowdsource or podcast function. But I'll get started, Robin, with a few questions that I have. I really enjoyed at the beginning of your book, you write in the prologue, a borderline citizen. For me, the complexity of the relationship of the citizen to his or her own nation is a big question of the 21st century. Where did we travel simply by consenting to be citizens of places of our birth? And how do these countries travel beyond us, writing their own travel narratives that bring us along or leave us behind, with or without consent? And one thing I think you do so well in this book and in the many books you've written is the way that you can weave a personal story where you're present with the story of the people that you're writing about and that you meet, and also with the historical background and narrative and research that goes into making these essays kind of bigger than the sum of their parts. And so I was just wondering if you could talk about authority and narratives, and how you, when you went into write this book and to report from these different places, we're able to, as all writers have to do, kind of convince yourself and tell yourself that you have the authority to go out and do this in different ways. How we have to trick ourselves in a sense into believing that before we can get started and go.
Yeah, well, this one was tricky in terms of authority, because I never want to be sort of a parachute journalist going into a place and saying, I'm going to write about your place. I think you can't claim total authority when you're writing, especially being a travel writer in the 21st century. You can't do that, because it's not the way it was 100 years ago or even 20 years ago. You can't assume travelers means the same thing, and that also travel is a privilege, and when you're going from one place to another, you have to be aware that other people maybe can't go in the opposite direction, and so borders are very real, and one's place and privilege, and certainly my privilege as a white male, is something I'm keenly aware of too as I'm doing this. So it's almost in some ways the opposite of authority in writing. I'm always looking for people who are authorities in their own right in the places that they live, and talking to them as someone who kind of wants to learn from them. And I think that that's a really important stance to take. Now, when I turn to the writing, I look for, that's where I sort of get the authority, is that it can take me a long time to write one of these essays. I mean, it can take me more than a year or two. I first take voluminous notes as I'm in a place. I take a lot of notes. I'm constantly taking notes. And then at the end of the day, no matter how tired I am, I try to write up the day as best as I remember it in my journal or diary. And that helps immensely when I'm trying to reconstruct scenes, because that's the kind of authority that you want as a writer. You want to be able to place the reader into the experience that you experienced. So there are two kinds of authority. There's the authority of being an insider or outsider, and I want to be an informed outsider, not claim that I'm an insider, and not sort of go in and just sort of tell other people's stories as though I'm an expert. But on the other hand, when I am writing about a place, once I'm reconstructing it, that's when I want to be an authoritative writer, in that I'm trying to bring the reader into my experience.
Good. I think today during the Visiting Writers Workshop, I really enjoyed how you were talking about speculation in nonfiction, and how that applies to your own work and how that applies to nonfiction that you enjoy. I was wondering if you might like to talk about that concept a little bit more right now.
About speculation?
Yeah, about the role speculation plays in nonfiction for you, and how you see nonfiction in general.
Yeah, I mean, speculation is an important way in which nonfiction writers imagine, that imagination, imaginative writing isn't only the domain of fiction writers, that, and as you know, nonfiction writers speculate all the time and have to in reconstructing something. One of the essays I wrote in the book, I went to this exclave of Russia called Kaliningrad, which is separated from the rest of Russia by Poland and Lithuania and Latvia, I believe. And it never was a part of Russia until the end of World War II. Before that, it was part of Prussia or Germany, part of Germany. And it was the birthplace of Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher Immanuel Kant. So when I went there on Russian Federation Day. And luckily I was with a good friend who speaks Russian fluently. And it was fascinating because I kept thinking about Kant and his life and how this city that he loved, that he never left during his entire lifetime, except for a couple of very short trips to Berlin, that he hadn't changed, but everything about the city had changed. Now it was this sort of post-Soviet Union city where only, during World War II, the city was flattened, and about the only thing that survived was Kant's grave, oddly enough, and even the church next door was demolished. So I was speculating about that, what Kant would have thought of this change to this place that he loved. It wasn't a kind of nostalgia or that, it was more of trying to think about how places change and how we think we're from a place, but a place is very mutable. It's not something that can always stay the same, that borders change, countries change all the time. And so that is a way in which I speculate, in which I try to speculate, is this notion of, even if we have this sort of imaginative attachment to land and place and nationhood, that is in itself a kind of speculation, that this idea that we belong to a nation is itself a kind of imaginative speculation that won't always be the case.
I think that's very well said. And in a sense, it ties into a question you've addressed in some of the interviews that have come out since the book was released. But I think the release date for this book was in March. Was in late March or early April. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit, not just about your own experience, which I think is fascinating, releasing a book now and how the book, what it was like for the book to come out, but also about how the world itself has changed. As you talk about the mutability and as you talk about the changing natures and definitions of the world around us, the time that's passed since this was released and where we are now has seen, some of the most extreme changes we tend to come across. So I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit and what it's been like for you.
Well, the book was released on the day that the CDC declared a pandemic. So that was my release date. That's how I, of course, when the lead up to a book, you have a lot of hopes, and you have, I had all these festivals I was booked for, it's one of these things, I could go on, but in the face of a pandemic, you can't whine about the fate of your book. You have to just sort of say, okay, you do what's best and what you can do. And I'm glad that I wrote the book and that it's out there and it's been getting some attention. But the world has changed a lot. I did one live event and then everything changed, but anyway, the world has changed and shows that obviously the pandemic knows no borders, and that became evident pretty quickly. And it just sort of highlighted to me how sad it is that the reaction of a lot of countries, my own included, was to increase its sense of competition and nationalism rather than pitch together, because obviously it would make things a lot better if we cooperated with other nations rather than blaming them or saying we're going to keep the vaccine for ourselves or whatever. So but I have a lot of friends who've had books come out at this time, And some of us sort of pitched in together to do joint events, and some of us, we've been sort of helping each other out. Because there've been, this is a good time to read books, so. Yeah.
Good. Just to go back to an earlier question with speculation nonfiction, you have a new journal called Speculative Nonfiction, that new magazine that you're creating and releasing. If you could talk about that, perhaps in a little more depth, which you've already touched on, that'd be great. But also, I was wondering if you, for some of the students in the audience, might want to talk a little bit about, the magazine and literary journal scene in general. And I was lucky enough to take a class with you when I was at Iowa. That was a literary journal class where the editors called in each week, and we, read a different literary journal each week. I just want to, you have such a great and knowledgeable experience with literary journals. I was wondering if you could talk about both your journal and the general state, of them right now, and what advice you might have for students.
Yeah, well, literary journals are a long-standing institution in the U.S. and elsewhere. It's where a lot of wonderful writers have first been introduced to the literary world. They tend to have very small audiences, maybe 1,000 people or 2,000, but the people reading them are very influential. They're agents and editors and other people sort of on the lookout for talented writers. I came from a literary family. My parents had, my father founded a New York publishing house, and that my mother and father both had journals. And so I saw it as a natural thing. I thought every kid had a literary journal. And so I started a journal recently with my co-editor and friend, Leela Phillip, called Speculative Nonfiction. And it's all about, we basically are interested in this sense of, the imaginative world of nonfiction writers. And it's online, speculativefiction.org. You can check it out. We have, in fact, we're accepting new submissions for our next issue on dwelling is our theme. We're accepting new submissions until the end of this month. We publish twice a year, and it's a great way to sort of be introduced to new writing, and also to take the plunge, if you haven't submitted your own work, to read another magazine, see if your work fits in, and then take the plunge and submit and see if you're accepted. But if you have to understand that most magazines get quite a few submissions, and so if you're not accepted, you shouldn't take it personally. It just means that try again or try somewhere else. And the thing about writing, is we all know, is that it just takes persistence and a lot of reading.
Yes. Well, we have a question from the audience. The question is, given the pandemic will influence international and domestic travel for years to come, what do you see in the future of travel writing?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know. I can't say for sure. I know in personal terms, I had a full schedule of travel. I was, as Tim mentioned, I was the founder of this international conference, NonfictioNOW, and it was going to be taking place in New Zealand this November, but the pandemic changed that. Now I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I think that that obviously it's going to be quite a while before people are able to travel, and my own sense of my desire to travel has changed too. I love to travel, but I also have sort of had my internal clock reset, as it were, by the pandemic, and so I think, though, to be a travel writer doesn't only mean to travel. a friend of mine, Philip Graham, says that all essays are in a sense travel essays. I'm not sure I agree with him completely, but I do think that travel essays can be written that are not about going somewhere and writing back about what you experience, but they are also possible. It's also possible to write travel essays that take place in the past, about past travelers, and also about or your relationship to a place that was and has been important to you. One of my favorite travel writers is the writer Jan Morris, who wrote this wonderful book called Trieste about her travels to the Italian port city of Trieste, but it's about much more than that. But a lot of it is about other people who spent time in Trieste, from James Joyce, Sir Richard Burton, and others, and not just about her. And so, in some ways, maybe it will recalibrate our sense of what a travel essay is and what it can be, that we will say we don't actually have to burn a lot of fossil fuel to write a travel essay. There are other ways, and other ways we can connect with people now that don't involve getting on a plane.
I think that's really well put. It reminds me of, did we read Atlas of Remote Islands? I think at Iowa it was about 15 islands I've never been to and never plan on traveling to, but I'm writing about that. One final question, and again, thank you so much for being here. It's been a great day with the workshop and also with the reading. As someone who's written on such varied subjects, from the beautiful book about your sister to the Play All, your short story collection, which I've always deeply enjoyed. I was wondering what you're thinking about writing next, and what topics are especially appealing to you right now.
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask that question. Well, I'm one of these writers who I take a long time to settle on what I'm writing next. And partly it's because, well, I think the pandemic really has changed a lot of priorities for me. And so what I thought I was going to be writing and what I now want to write feel very different. And so I tend to kick around a bunch of ideas for a while. And I have too many ideas. I can't write them all. You only have a limited amount of time, and you have to really get obsessed by an idea. And I'm almost at the point of obsession with one idea. But, I think about it a lot, but I've been very busy with a new job and moving. So it's been a little difficult for me. But I think what I'm going to be writing, I'm going to be going back to a kind of hybrid of fiction and nonfiction, because that's really what I'm interested in right now, is crossing genre borders, I'd say.
Great. Well, thank you again, Robin, for being here. Everyone, thank you very much for coming to this Fall for the Book event. And
thank you, Tim.
It's been great. Well, thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.